Thanks, Peter. I think that for a lot of us who did actually welcome the idea of multiculturalism a few years ago, it was very much on the basis that it was about aspects of the kind of aspects of culture you were talking about, and the fact that we could dress differently and that we could live in different ways, but that it would always be underpinned by a universal set of values. And I think one of the reasons that I have come to be critical of the whole idea of multiculturalism is the way in which it's given certain groups almost an opt-out from those values, and the opportunity to use power in an oppressive way over members of people they identify as part of their communities. Mariam, can I come to you finally?
Sure. Hi, hello everyone. I'm sorry I keep coughing and making a big noise, but I want to try to keep it really short so that we can have some time to hear from you as well. So I'm going to speak for no more than 5 minutes, and you can start throwing things at me if I go over that 5 minutes. But there's a couple of points I think are important when we're discussing this issue. And one is the whole reality that multiculturalism, what it does is it reduces real live human beings to one culture. You know, so I think that's why what's so fundamentally problematic with it is that the reality is, as other speakers have said as well, is that culture is not one homogeneous thing. It's static, it's not static, it's moving, and different people have different cultures, even within a given society or a given community. And therefore, when you reduce entire groups of people to one culture, you end up really restricting the space that people have within what they're being labeled as being part a given culture. You restrict their ability to think differently, to breathe, to be able to live the way they want, and so on and so forth. I think this is one of the very real problems with it. And also what happens is when you talk about, for example, a Muslim culture or a Muslim community, you then take the most regressive, you know, point of that culture, which is Islamism, you know, and then say that basically that Islamism, the Muslim Council of Britain, the Islamic Republic of Iran, they represent an entire group of people, masses of people, millions of people. And in a sense, what therefore happens is that, you know, people in that community become Islamists, and you basically hand them over to Islamism if we take this community. And in a sense, people are caught in the middle. You know, you have the far right, which says that's your culture, get the hell out of this country, you shouldn't be living in Britain, you're different than we are. Whereas I think one of the things we talk about very often is that people, even in a small village in Iran, or you saw the women's rights protests in Algeria, their culture is not Islamism's culture, and they're often at the forefront of resisting it. And then you're betrayed by the left and progressive social movement that look at that culture positively. The far right looks at it negatively and says, you don't belong here. The left looks at it positively and says, look, you're not veiled, you're not part of that culture. You have no right to speak. So if you come to an anti-war demonstration, we need to be veiled in solidarity with the people of Iraq, as if women want to be veiled in Iraq, or, you know, that's the only choice that you're left with cultural relativism. And this is a huge problem in a sense. It drags communities into regression, and you know, and forces them, actually imposes on them as if it's their culture and their belief, a culture and belief that's often that of the ruling elite, and one that's often imposed by brute and sheer force. Brute and sheer force. The other point I'll raise, since I've got another 2-3 minutes, is that when this happens, what happens is that the human being doesn't matter anymore. If you are that culture, then it doesn't really matter what you think and what you want. And so if I say, I want to be an ex-Muslim, I want to leave Islam, I don't want to die for leaving Islam, they'll say, you're being racist, you're attacking the Muslim community. You know, what you're saying is just Islamophobic, it's racist, it's wrong. Because people don't matter anymore. It's the culture that has precedence. And this is what cultural relativism does. It reduces, you know, so many people to one culture, one regressive culture. And it forces you to stay within that box. I think the reality of the matter is that we as individuals have so many different characteristics that define us and that we define ourselves by. And by defining an entire community, the Muslim community, or an Islamic culture, you do, what you do tend to do is, I think by doing so, it's part of the effort to Islamicize that community and to hand it over to Islamism, if you know what I mean. And finally, I'll just say one other point on the issue of, culture is that, as I said, so many different beliefs and cultures within any sort of given community. There's a choice involved, isn't it? When the progressive, so-called progressive and left groups choose the Muslim Council of Britain over us, they make a choice, because you can choose. You can choose, to side with Sakina Mohammadi Ashtiani, who's facing death by stoning, or you can side with Islamism and say, well, stoning is their culture and their religion. And I think, so that choice is actually a political choice and one that we have to resist. And finally, that universal rights is, I think, one of the key ways out of this dilemma that we've come into. And that is saying that people, irrespective of their beliefs and irrespective of the so-called communities they come from, the background they have universal rights. And it's interesting how often we hear how universal rights are Western, when in Iran, for example, the Iranian regime doesn't say, I don't want nuclear technology, it's Western, or I don't want, the latest tools to repress and torture, political dissidents. This is coming from a Western company. These are never Western. The latest machinery to gun down protesters, the latest machinery to torture and kill. But when it comes to rights, and particularly women's rights, they become Western. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the people who are supposed to be your allies, who are betraying you, use that language too. And when you demand rights, you become, a Westerner who is supporting Western values. And I think the point I want to make is that they are universal. Thank you.
Thanks, Mariam.